She heard 4 words in Spanish, en la copa cristal, and her blood turned to ice. In the glass. The poison was in the glass. Maddy didn't move. She couldn't. Her flower basket hung frozen on her arm, a single unsold rose trembling between her fingers as she stood pressed against the iron gate of the white estate, invisible the way street girls always were to men in expensive suits. The 2 guards hadn't even glanced at her. Why would they? She was nobody. A girl with a wicker basket and worn-down shoes, selling roses outside a gala she would never be invited into. People like her didn't exist to people like them. That was their first mistake. Her name was Maddy, 22 years old, 5'4". The kind of girl whose name nobody remembered and whose face nobody could quite place after she left a room. She sold flowers on the corner of 5th and Grand every Friday evening to help her grandmother cover the electricity bill, and she had exactly $11 in her pocket, 2 roses left in her basket, and absolutely no reason to be standing outside one of the most dangerous men in the city's private estate at 8:47 p.m. Except she'd heard those 4 words. And her father, God rest him, had spent 12 years teaching her that Spanish was never just a language. It was a secret, a weapon, a warning. Tonight it was all 3. Kim White was 36 years old, and he had not survived this long by trusting people. He had built his empire the way a surgeon builds, with precision, with cold calculation, and with the absolute certainty that every person in his orbit had a price. He knew the cost of loyalty. He knew the weight of betrayal. He had learned both lessons young, and the tattoo creeping up the left side of his neck was the permanent reminder of what happened to men who forgot them. He walked toward his estate tonight with his briefcase in one hand and the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, because in this city he was. He did not notice the girl at the gate. That was his first mistake. Maddy watched him approach through the iron bars, her heart hammering so loud she was certain the guards would hear it. She had already tried to warn his driver. Chen had looked at her the way everyone looked at her, past her, through her, like she was furniture on a sidewalk, and had driven away without a word. She had approximately 40 seconds before Kim White walked through those gates, shook hands with men who wanted him dead, and lifted a crystal glass filled with something that would stop his heart before midnight. 40 seconds to decide whether a girl with $11 and 2 roses had any business grabbing the arm of the most feared man in the city. 39. 38. Maddy stepped forward. No confis in ellos. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Her hand locked around his arm before her brain could stop her, and she leaned in close enough to see the exact moment his cold eyes dropped to her face, close enough to watch the ice in them crack just slightly at the edges. Don't trust them. Kim White stopped walking. For 3 full seconds, he said nothing. He simply looked down at her, this girl with the flower basket and the high puff and the expression of someone who had just decided that bravery mattered more than survival, and the corner of his jaw tightened. You have exactly 1 sentence, he said quietly, to make me believe you're not insane. Maddy lifted her chin. The crystal glass on the center table, she said. The one they'll hand you at midnight. I heard them say it. In Spanish. En la copa cristal. The briefcase in Kim White's hand did not move, but his eyes did. Before we begin, if you're new here, hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to every single one of you. Now let's get into it. The roses were not selling. Maddy had been standing on the corner of 5th and Grand for nearly 2 hours, her wicker basket looped over one arm, her feet aching in the flats she'd worn so many times the soles had started to separate at the toe. She had 8 roses left and exactly $4 in her pocket, and her grandmother's electricity bill was due in 3 days, and none of that was the problem she would remember about this particular Friday night. The problem was the black sedan. It had been idling against the curb outside the White Estate's iron gate for the better part of 20 minutes. Long enough to be strange, not long enough to be alarming. Maddy had clocked it the way she clocked everything on this block. Quietly, without looking directly at it, the way her father had taught her. Mija, eyes like water. Still on the surface. Everything underneath. The 2 men standing beside it wore dark suits that were too expensive for security guards and too rigid for guests. They stood with their backs to the street, heads angled toward each other, and they were speaking low and fast in a language that wrapped itself around Maddy's spine like a cold hand. Spanish. She didn't react. She adjusted the strap of her basket and turned slightly, pretending to rearrange the roses, and she listened. Most people on this block didn't speak Spanish. Most people on this block didn't look at her either. Both of those things were working in her favor right now. Está confirmado para la medianoche, one of them said. It's confirmed for midnight. En la copa cristal. No lo toques hasta que él la levante. In the crystal glass. Don't touch it until he lifts it. The second guard glanced around once, right past Maddy without a flicker of concern, and nodded. Cuando brinde, ya es tard para él. When he toasts, it's already too late for him. Maddy did not drop the rose in her hand. She came very close. She stood perfectly still while her heart detonated quietly in her chest, and she breathed, and she thought about her father, and she looked at the gate of the white estate with its iron spires catching the last of the evening light. Somebody was going to die tonight at midnight, and she was the only person on this street who knew it. She didn't have to wait long to see who. The convoy arrived at 8:32 p.m., 3 black vehicles, the kind with tinted glass so dark they seemed to absorb the streetlights rather than reflect them. They pulled up to the gate in a formation that spoke of habit, of ritual, of a man whose every movement had been choreographed down to the second. Kim White stepped out of the middle car. Maddy had seen powerful men before. This city had no shortage of them. Men in tailored suits who walked like the sidewalk owed them something, who looked through people like Maddy the way you look through a window. But Kim White was something different. Something colder. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit him with the precision of a second skin. His white shirt was crisp enough to have been pressed an hour ago. His dark blue tie sat perfectly knotted. He carried a brown leather briefcase in his right hand, and he moved toward the gate with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his adult life been made to wait for anything. The tattoo on the left side of his neck, dark ink, intricate lines, was the only thing about him that didn't belong in a boardroom. It was a reminder, a signature, a warning that whatever this man had built in glass towers and tailored suits, it had been built on something older and harder and far less clean. He did not look at Maddy. He did not look at anyone who wasn't already part of his world. She watched him approach the gate, watched one of the Spanish-speaking guards step forward and open it with a deferential nod, watched Kim White walk through without breaking his stride, and her stomach dropped. He had no idea. Not a flicker. He was walking through a door that his own security had already decided would be his last, and he was doing it with the absolute confidence of a man who had never imagined that the people he paid could be the people who buried him. The gate swung closed behind him. Maddy had approximately 3.5 hours until midnight. She stood there for 60 seconds doing absolutely nothing. Then she thought about her father. Hector James had been a maintenance worker, a church-going man, a Sunday morning pancake maker, and a laughing, stubborn, beautiful man who had spent 12 years teaching his daughter the Spanish he'd learned from the Colombian woman who ran the laundromat on his first job. He said it was practical. He said language was the one thing nobody could take from you. He said, Maddy, baby, when you understand what people think you can't understand, you see the whole world different. He had died 4 years ago, a Tuesday in November, a hit and run on the same block where he'd walked every day for 20 years. The driver was never found. The case was closed in 8 months. Hector James was buried in a plot her grandmother was still paying off, and Maddy sold roses on the corner of 5th and Grand every Friday because the electricity bill didn't care about grief. Her father had never met Kim White. He had never set foot inside the White estate. But he had spent 12 years making sure that his daughter understood exactly what 4 words in Spanish really meant. En la copa cristal. No lo toques. In the crystal glass. Don't touch it. Maddy thought about what a good, sensible girl would do right now. A good, sensible girl would go home. Would call the police, except that the police in this city and Kim White's world existed in a complicated arrangement that made calling them feel like throwing a match into a gasoline conversation. Would tell herself it wasn't her problem. Would remember that she had $11 and a grandmother and exactly no power in any room this man occupied. Then she thought about her father's hands, patient and warm, drawing Spanish letters on the back of a church bulletin. "You see the whole world different, Mija." Maddy set her flower basket down, tucked the remaining roses under her arm, and looked at the iron gate. She had never been sensible. Her grandmother had always said so. Hector would have laughed and called it a gift. She straightened her teal shirt, smoothed her black pants, and started moving. The driver, a lean, tight-jawed man named Ray who'd been with Kim White for 6 years, was standing beside the lead vehicle smoking a cigarette when Maddy approached him. She had rehearsed her opening sentence 3 times in her head. She led with the most important word first. "Excuse me. There's a plot to kill your employer tonight." Ray looked at her the way people looked at cracks in the sidewalk. His eyes dropped to her flower basket, to her worn flats, to the single rose still clutched in her left hand, and he took a long drag of his cigarette. "How much?" he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "For the rose." "How much?" He was already reaching into his jacket pocket, already pulling out a bill the way you'd hand money to a parking meter, automatic, dismissive, completely without interest in the machine itself. "I'm not here to sell you a rose." Maddy kept her voice steady. "I heard 2 of your guards talking near the sedan. In Spanish. They said the poison is in a crystal glass. At midnight when Mr. White toasts." "Look." Ray cut her off, not unkindly, but with the absolute finality of a man who had heard every possible version of this kind of conversation. "I don't know what you heard, or what you think you heard, but Mr. White's security team has been vetted at a level you cannot imagine. Whatever you're selling," he tucked the bill into her flower basket without asking. "Go home. It's a cold night." He dropped the cigarette, stepped on it, and got back in the car. Maddy stood on the sidewalk with a $20 bill in her basket and a warning that nobody wanted to hear, and she thought, very clearly and very calmly, fine. She would have to go in herself. The east wall of the White estate had a service entrance she'd noticed because she'd noticed everything about this block for 3 years. It was used on Friday afternoons for catering deliveries, and on this particular Friday, a catering company's white van was still parked at the curb with its back doors hanging open and a young man in a white coat leaning against it scrolling his phone. Maddy walked up to him and said, "I'm the florist. They asked me to bring the centerpiece arrangements through the back. I'm running late." She held up her remaining roses. The young man looked at the roses, looked at her, shrugged and waved her through with the complete indifference of a person who was being paid $11 an hour and had approximately 0 investment in the guest list. The service corridor smelled like garlic butter and warm bread. Maddy moved through it quickly, keeping her head down, following the sound of elegant chatter and live music filtering through the walls. She had gotten perhaps 40 feet inside when she heard voices ahead and recognized the accent. She pressed herself flat against the wall behind a catering cart and held her breath. 2 figures crossed the corridor intersection ahead of her, suits dark, voices low, speaking in the same rapid Spanish she'd heard at the gate. One of them was checking something on his phone. The other was carrying a small silver tray covered with a white cloth. She waited. 5 seconds. They turned left and disappeared. Maddy exhaled and kept moving. The gala had already begun. The main hall of the White estate was the kind of room that was designed to make people feel small and grateful to be allowed inside it. The ceiling vaulted upward in dark coffered panels, and the chandeliers threw amber light across 100 people who moved like they had been born knowing how to hold a champagne flute. A string quartet occupied one corner. A long banquet table ran the length of the far wall, set with silver and crystal that caught the light and scattered it like broken stars. Maddy stood at the edge of the hall in her teal shirt and black pants and wicker basket and understood completely why nobody stopped her. She looked like the help. She moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no time to explain it to you, which was the most reliable camouflage she had ever discovered. She found the crystal glass in 40 seconds. It was exactly as she had imagined. A single glass set apart from the others at the head of the table, taller, more elaborate, its cut facets catching the light differently than the champagne flutes surrounding it. It sat alone like a small monument, set deliberately, waiting. Beside it, she noticed one of the Spanish-speaking guards standing 3 feet away, hands clasped at his back, watching the room with the patient stillness of someone who was waiting for a specific moment to arrive. Maddy looked at the clock on the far wall. 11:41 p.m. 19 minutes. She scanned the room and found Kim White at the far end, deep in conversation with a silver-haired man in a tuxedo, his briefcase gone now, his posture slightly more open than it had been outside, though his eyes still moved across the room the way a hawk's moved across open ground. Calculating. Cataloging. Never fully at rest. She began moving toward him. She had $11, 2 roses, and 19 minutes to stop a man who did not know she existed from dying in his own house. Her father would have loved this story, she thought. He always said the best ones started impossible. If you're still reading, drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. I want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss what happens next. It's about to get intense. She was 12 feet away when the silver-haired man stepped aside and a woman in a red dress appeared at Kim White's elbow, leaning in to say something that made the small crowd around him turn toward the banquet table. The string quartet softened. A ripple of movement went through the room, guests turning, drifting, orienting themselves toward the table's head the way flowers turn toward light. It was time for the toast. Maddy moved faster. She was 8 feet away when one of Kim's loyalists, a broad man with a shaved head who had been watching her cross the room for the last 30 seconds, stepped into her path with one hand raised. "Miss, this section is no confis in ellos." She said it loud enough for the words to cut through the low music and the polished chatter and the careful orchestration of the room, and Kim White's head turned, not slowly, not gradually, but with the sharp, reflexive precision of a man whose survival had always depended on his ability to identify what was different in any given moment. His eyes found her immediately. She didn't wait for permission. She stepped around the loyalist, closed the remaining distance in 4 strides, and grabbed Kim White's arm with both hands, her flower basket swinging, one rose falling to the floor, and she leaned up toward him and she spoke low and fast and clear. "The crystal glass at the head of the table. They put something in it. Your own guards, the 2 on the East detail, they've been speaking Spanish all evening because they assumed no one here would understand them. I heard them at the gate. I heard them in the corridor. En la copa cristal. The poison is in your glass. The toast is the signal. The moment you drink, they walk." The room had not stopped. The music was still playing. No one but Kim's immediate circle had heard her. Kim White looked down at her for 3 full seconds with an expression she could not read, not anger, not amusement, something older and more dangerous than either, and then he looked at the crystal glass at the head of the table. Then he looked at the guard standing 3 feet beside it. Something shifted in his face. Just slightly. Just enough. "Let her go, Tay," he said quietly to the loyalist behind her. Then, to Maddy, "Stay exactly where you are." What happened next took 6 minutes and was elegant in the way that only something planned by a very cold and very intelligent man can be elegant. Kim White walked to the head of the table. He lifted the crystal glass. He turned to the room with the unhurried ease of a man enjoying his own party, and he smiled, and it was the first time Maddy had seen him smile, and she understood immediately that it was not a warm smile. It was a door closing. "Before we toast," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "I'd like to ask my East security detail to join us up here. Both of them. I want to thank them personally for their work this evening." The room applauded. The 2 guards did not move immediately. They exchanged a look, fast, barely a flicker, and that flicker was enough. 3 of Kim's loyalists were already moving before the guards took their first step toward the exit. The exits had already been covered. The guards got approximately 12 feet before they understood that the room had changed shape around them without anyone raising their voice. They were escorted out through the service corridor. The string quartet kept playing. Kim White set the crystal glass down and nodded once to a man near the kitchen, who appeared with a small case and a woman Maddy vaguely recognized as the kind of person who tested things rather than drank them. The woman dipped a strip into the glass, examined it under a small light, and looked at Kim with the flat, professional expression of someone delivering information rather than a verdict. She nodded. The room never knew. The toast was made with champagne flutes, The silver-haired man gave a speech about growth and prosperity, and the gala continued until 11:58 as though nothing had happened. Maddy stood against the wall with her wicker basket and her one remaining rose and watched Kim White move through the room, and she thought, he already knew something was wrong. He just needed someone to tell him what. At 11:59 p.m., he found her by the east corridor. "You came in through the catering entrance," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. You told the catering staff you were the florist. I had roses." He looked at her basket. He looked at the single rose. Something in his expression shifted, not the cold smile from before, but something harder to name. Something that looked almost like being seen catching yourself feeling something you weren't prepared for. "Who are you?" he said. "Maddy James." She held out the rose. "That'll be $2. For the first time in a long time, Kim White laughed. He sent a car for her the following Sunday. She came home from church with her grandmother, Nana Ruth, to find a black vehicle idling outside their building and a man in a dark coat standing on the stoop with an envelope. Inside the envelope was a note with an address and a time written in precise, unhurried handwriting, and a single line beneath it. "I owe you a conversation at minimum." Nana Ruth looked at the car. Looked at Maddy. Said, "Baby, what did you do?" "I'll explain later, Grandma." "You'll explain now." She explained. Nana Ruth sat at the kitchen table through the whole of it with her hands folded and her expressions cycling through fear and anger, and something that Maddy eventually recognized as the same stubborn, bottomless pride she'd seen on her father's face every time Maddy had done something reckless and gotten away with it. When Maddy finished, Nana Ruth said, "Your father taught you that Spanish." "Yes, ma'am." "Then go." She stood up and straightened Maddy's collar. "But take your good shoes." The address was not an office. It was a house, a real one, in a quiet neighborhood north of the city, with a porch and a garden that had been recently replanted and a kitchen that smelled like someone was actually cooking in it. Kim White answered the door in a gray sweater and dark pants, and without the suit and the briefcase and the cold, performative stillness of the gala, he looked like a different version of himself, not softer exactly, but more honest. He had done his research in the 36 hours since the gala. She understood that immediately. "Your father was Hector James," he said, once they were seated at the kitchen table with coffee she hadn't asked for but was grateful for. "Maintenance worker. Sunday school teacher at Mt. Zion Baptist on Clement Street. Died 4 years ago. Hit and run. Case closed." Maddy looked at her cup. "Yes. I know who closed that case." He said it carefully. "And why?" She looked up. "It wasn't my organization," he said. "But it was my world. And I knew about it and did nothing because it wasn't my problem." He held her gaze without flinching. "That was wrong. I'm telling you that directly, not because it changes anything, but because you deserve to hear it said without anyone softening it." The kitchen was very quiet. Maddy said, "What was in the case?" "My drivers were being used to move product. Your father saw something he shouldn't have during a maintenance call. Someone made a phone call. That's all it took." He set down his cup. "The man who made that call is currently in a federal holding facility for an unrelated matter. He will not be released." She didn't ask how he knew that. She didn't ask what unrelated meant. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and refused to cry in front of this man, and she mostly succeeded. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you walked into my house with a flower basket and saved my life and I owe you more than $2. He almost smiled. "And because I think you are the most dangerous kind of person I've ever encountered." "Dangerous? You have nothing to lose. And you still chose to do the right thing." He looked at her steadily. "That's not common. In my experience, it's almost non-existent." What came after was not immediate. Real things rarely are. It started with a conversation, then a second one, then a series of meetings in the kitchen of the quiet house north of the city where Kim White was, quietly, in the process of becoming someone he had not been before. The empire was not dissolved. It was redirected. Carefully, methodically, in the way that only a man who understood how power actually moved could do it without everything collapsing at once. He had started the process before the gala, he told her. The assassination attempt had been a consequence of it. The people who had profited from his operation were not interested in watching it go legitimate. They had hired the guards. They had arranged the glass. They had underestimated, as everyone seemed to underestimate, the fact that the most consequential intervention in a room full of powerful people sometimes arrived in a teal button-down shirt with a wicker basket and a dead man's Spanish. Maddy started working for him 3 months later. Not as an assistant. Not as a charity case. As the voice he needed in rooms where his reputation preceded him like a storm cloud and made honest people tighten up. She was the opposite of that. She had always been invisible to the powerful, which meant the powerless had always been entirely comfortable telling her the truth. She knew what the community on 5th and Grand actually needed. She knew what the families in the buildings near the old estate looked like from the inside. She knew what $11 felt like on a Friday night when the bill was due and the roses weren't selling. That knowledge was worth more than everything in Kim White's briefcase, and he was finally smart enough to understand that. The foundation was announced on the first Saturday of March. It was called the Hector James Community Trust, and it was established with a founding grant of $2 million directed toward workforce development, youth mentorship, and emergency utility assistance for residents in the 5th Ward. Kim White gave a short speech at the press conference, precise, unornamented, characteristically without excess, and then he stepped back from the podium and nodded at the woman standing to his left. Maddy James stepped forward. She was wearing a teal button-down shirt. She had decided that on purpose. She had written the speech herself, at her grandmother's kitchen table, on the back of an old electricity bill, in the early morning quiet before Nana Ruth woke up. She had revised it 4 times. She had read it aloud to the photograph of her father on the mantel, and when she reached the 3rd paragraph, she had stopped and put the pages down and allowed herself, finally, to cry, and then she had wiped her face and read it again from the beginning. She stood at the podium now with the city spread out behind her and a crowd that included people from 5th and Grand who had seen her sell roses for 3 years without knowing her name, and she thought about 4 words in Spanish and a man who had been willing to listen, and a father who had spent 12 years making sure his daughter understood what the world was actually saying when it thought no one was listening. She looked out at the crowd. She found her grandmother in the 3rd row, small and upright in her good Sunday coat, hands folded in her lap, eyes shining. Maddy smiled. Then she leaned into the microphone and she began. And that is the story of a girl with a flower basket, $11, and a dead man's Spanish, who walked into the most dangerous room in the city and walked out having changed everything. Maddy didn't have power. She didn't have status. She didn't have a seat at the table. She had 4 words. And the courage to say them. If this story moved you, if you felt something when Maddy grabbed that arm, when Kim White laughed for the first time, when Nana Ruth straightened her collar and said, "Go," then this channel is exactly where you belong. We tell stories here. Real ones. The kind where the overlooked girl wins. Where the invisible woman is seen. Where loyalty, bravery, and love always, always, outlast power and betrayal. So here's what I need from you right now. Thumbs up, hit that like button. It tells the world this story is worth watching. Bell, subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss the moment a new story drops. Speech balloon, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I will say hello to you personally. It doesn't matter if you're watching from Atlanta or Abuja, from London or Lagos, from a small town or a big city, you matter here. And if you want more stories like Maddy's, stories about women who were underestimated, men who were transformed, and moments where one act of bravery rewrote someone's entire destiny, the next story is already waiting for you. Just click. I'll be right there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. Now go share this with somebody who needs to hear it today. See you in the next story.